My son Leo's 13th birthday was supposed to be a milestone of joy at our family's estate. I'm Elena Vance, a 42-year-old architect who thought she had built a foundation of trust within this family. But the moment Leo walked into the dining room, the celebration died. A jagged dark bruise sat under his eye, contrasting sharply with his pale, trembling face. My heart didn't just sink. Nausea hit me like a physical blow. Before I could even speak, my sister's son, a smirking 16-year-old, leaned back and chuckled. "I was just teaching him a lesson, Aunt Elena. My parents always say I'm never wrong anyway." A few relatives actually laughed, a sickening sound that rippled through the room. My parents, Arthur and Martha, smiled at their eldest grandson as if his cruelty was merely a sign of leadership. I ignored them, my eyes locked on my son. "Leo, tell me exactly what happened," I demanded, my voice vibrating with a mother's rage. Leo's gaze flickered to my sister Audrey, who was suddenly very busy staring at her plate. Then, in a whisper that cut through the room like a blade, he asked Mom, "Why did Aunt Audrey lock the cellar door while he was hitting me?" The silence that followed was deafening. My sister's hand jerked, and her wine glass slipped, shattering against the hardwood floor. The crimson liquid splattered like a crime scene across her expensive dress. She looked at me, her face draining of color, and I realized then that the family I loved was actually a nest of vipers. This was only the beginning of a betrayal that goes deeper than I ever imagined. If you want to see how I dismantled their lies and protected my son, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss how this revenge unfolds. Now let's get into the dark truth behind that locked door. 2 weeks before that disastrous dinner, the air inside Vance Architectural Firm felt unusually heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't quite name. I stood in my private studio, the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at the blueprints for the Oak Ridge development. This project was my pride, a sustainable housing complex that had taken me 8 months to conceptualize. As I flipped through the digital files on our shared server, my heart skipped a beat. A subfolder labeled Alternative Concepts had been created under Audrey's credentials. I clicked it, expecting to see her administrative notes, but instead I found my own master designs. They were identical in structure and aesthetic, yet the metadata showed they had been exported to an external drive just hours earlier. Audrey, my older sister and the firm's operations manager, had no reason to be duplicating my technical drawings. My pulse quickened as a cold realization settled in my chest. Someone was preparing to move my work outside these walls. I walked toward the executive suite, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble, a sound that usually commanded respect, but now felt like a warning. I found Audrey sitting at the mahogany desk that once belonged to our grandfather, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. She didn't look up as I entered. "Audrey, why are my Oak Ridge files sitting in your private export folder?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through me. She finally glanced up, a thin, patronizing smile playing on her lips, the kind of look she used to give me when we were children, and she had broken one of my dolls. "Honestly, Elena, you're so high-strung lately." She sighed, leaning back in the chair. "I was simply backing them up for the presentation with the investors. You know how disorganized the creative department can be. I'm just doing my job to protect the family legacy." Her dismissiveness was a slap in the face, an arrogant assertion that her administrative role gave her dominion over my intellectual property. Before I could retort, the door swung open, and our parents, Arthur and Martha, strolled in. They weren't supposed to be in the office until the afternoon board meeting. My father, Arthur, adjusted his silk tie, his eyes immediately landing on Audrey with a look of unearned pride. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he had already decided I was the one causing it. I turned to him, clutching the tablet displaying the unauthorized exports. "Dad, Audrey is moving my primary design files to an external drive without authorization. This is a massive security breach for the firm." My mother Martha stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Audrey's shoulder while giving me a weary, disappointed look. Elena, dear, don't be so dramatic. Audrey has always had a better head for the business side of things. If she feels a backup is necessary, then it is. We should be grateful she's looking out for the firm's interests while you're buried in your sketches. The blatant favoritism was suffocating. It didn't matter that I was the lead architect, or that my vision kept the company afloat. In their eyes, Audrey was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was merely the worker bee who needed supervision. I retreated to my office, the bitter taste of betrayal lingering in my mouth. But the professional sabotage wasn't the only thing haunting me. That evening, when I picked up my son Leo from the firm's daycare center, he wasn't his usual vibrant self. Usually he'd run to me, eager to show off his latest charcoal drawings or talk about his robotics club. Instead, I found him sitting in a corner, his shoulders hunched, staring blankly at a sketchbook that remained tucked under his arm. When he saw Audrey walking down the hallway toward us, his entire body went rigid. He didn't just look away. He physically recoiled, stepping behind my coat as if trying to vanish. Audrey blew him a kiss, a gesture that looked performative and hollow. "See you at the estate later, little man," she chirped, her voice dripping with a forced sweetness that made my skin crawl. Leo didn't respond. He gripped my hand so hard his knuckles turned white, his small fingers trembling against my palm. "Leo, honey, what's wrong? Did something happen with Julian today?" I whispered once we were safely inside the car. He stared out the window at the passing New York skyline, his jaw set in a way that reminded me painfully of myself when I was backed into a corner. "It's nothing, Mom. Julian was just being a jerk," he muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. I noticed a small red mark on his wrist, partially hidden by his sleeve. When I reached for it, he flinched, pulling his arm away with a speed that spoke of deep-seated fear. He wouldn't look me in the eye for the rest of the drive. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the things he was too terrified to say, and the things I was beginning to suspect. My sister was circling my career like a shark, and somehow her shadow was falling over my son's life in a way that felt increasingly predatory. I realized then that the foundation of our family wasn't just cracked, it was eroding, and the people I trusted most were the ones holding the shovels. The atmosphere at the Vance family estate during Sunday brunch was deceptively calm, a sharp contrast to the storm brewing in my mind. We were gathered in the sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of expensive coffee and fresh pastries filling the air. Yet I felt like an outsider in my own home. Audrey had been unusually frantic, juggling 2 phones and her iPad while whispering sharply to her husband Derek. When she hurried to the kitchen to consult with the catering staff about the upcoming gala, she carelessly left her tablet face down on the wicker side table next to my chair. A notification chimed, a persistent rhythmic sound that grated on my nerves. Thinking it was my own device since we used identical silver cases, I picked it up and swiped the screen. It wasn't locked. What greeted me wasn't a schedule of architectural meetings, but a string of messages from Derek that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. The conversation thread was a roadmap of clinical, cold-hearted betrayal. Derek had sent a series of documents with a caption that read, "The mental health clause is ready. Once we trigger it, Elena won't have the legal standing to contest your appointment as CEO." My hands began to shake so violently I had to set the tablet on my lap to keep from dropping it. They weren't just trying to outmaneuver me professionally. They were planning to use my recent stress and the extra hours I spent working to paint a picture of psychological instability. Audrey's replies were even worse. She spoke about me not as a sister, but as an obstacle to be cleared away. "Mom and Dad are already on board," she had typed. "They think they're protecting the firm by consolidating power under me. They signed the limited power of attorney yesterday." The sheer weight of that sentence felt like a physical crushing of my lungs. My own parents, Arthur and Martha, had sat across from me at dinner last night, smiling and nodding, while secretly signing away my rights to the legacy I had built. I scrolled further back, my eyes burning as I unearthed a darker layer to their financial desperation. There were bank transfer receipts, massive sums of money totaling over $500,000 moved from the Vance architectural firm's contingency fund into an offshore account. The memos weren't for business expenses. Derek had sent a frantic message 3 weeks ago. Julian's debt to the bookies in Atlantic City has doubled. If we don't clear the $60,000 by Friday, they're coming to the house. Use the Oak Ridge payroll tax reserve. Elena won't notice until the quarterly audit. Audrey had replied with a simple, chilling, "Done. I'll ghost the entries." My nephew Julian wasn't just a bully. He was a liability whose gambling addiction was being fueled by the systematic theft of my hard work. Audrey was draining the company's lifeblood to cover the tracks of her delinquent son, all while plotting to institutionalize me to keep the faucet running. The sound of Audrey's heels returning to the conservatory sent a jolt of pure electricity through my spine. I quickly swiped the screen off and placed the tablet exactly where I had found it, leaning back and taking a forced sip of my lukewarm tea. "Elena, you look like you've seen a ghost," Audrey remarked, her eyes darting suspiciously toward her device as she reclaimed it. Her voice was light, but there was a predatory sharpness in her gaze that I had never truly acknowledged before. "Just tired, Audrey. It's been a long week at the firm." I replied, my voice sounding hollow and distant even to my own ears. She offered a superficial pat on my shoulder, a gesture that felt like a snake testing its prey. Across the table, Arthur was laughing at a joke Derek made, his eyes bright with a warmth that I now knew was a lie. Martha was carefully adjusting a floral arrangement, the very picture of maternal grace, yet she was complicit in a scheme to strip her younger daughter of everything. I felt a sudden desperate need to find Leo and get out of that house before I screamed. Every smile in that room felt like a jagged blade, every kind word a calculated deception. I had spent years believing that if I worked hard enough and stayed loyal enough, I would be valued. Instead, I was being harvested. My parents weren't just favoring Audrey. They were actively participating in my destruction to preserve the status quo of their perfect family. As I walked toward the gardens to find my son, I realized that the rules of engagement had changed. I wasn't just fighting for a title or a seat at the board table anymore. I was fighting for my survival and Leo's future. The woman who walked into that brunch was a sister and a daughter who wanted to belong. The woman who walked out was a strategist who realized that in a den of vipers, the only way to survive is to be the one with the most lethal bite. The Monday morning following that revelation felt different, as if I were viewing my life through a high-definition lens for the first time. I didn't go straight to the firm. Instead, I met Sarah in a quiet, dimly lit corner of a cafe 3 towns over. Sarah had been my closest friend and a ruthless legal assistant at the firm for 6 years. I didn't need to explain the depth of the betrayal. I simply handed her an encrypted thumb drive containing the photos I had taken of Audrey's tablet. "I need every tax filing, every intellectual property patent, and every expense report from the last 18 months audited," I told her, my voice low and steady. Sarah's eyes scanned the initial documents, her jaw tightening with every line she read. "Elena, if these numbers are accurate, Audrey isn't just skimming off the top. She's hollowing out the foundation of Vance Architectural. But there's something else you need to be careful about," she warned, leaning closer. Sarah had overheard Derek talking to a private medical consultant on the office balcony. They were gathering evidence of my supposed erratic behavior. Every missed meeting or late night spent working was being logged as a symptom of a mental breakdown. While Sarah began dismantling the financial lies, I returned to the estate to confront a different kind of rot. I waited until Audrey and Derek were out at a charity function before entering Leo's room. He was hunched over his desk, frantically sketching a complex structural layout that looked far too advanced for a middle school project. When I gently touched his shoulder, he jumped instinctively, covering the paper with his arms. "Leo, show me," I said softly but firmly. "It wasn't his homework. It was a complete conceptual rendering for a boutique hotel, a project Julian had supposedly won a junior architecture award for at his private academy. I pulled Leo into my lap, feeling how thin and brittle he seemed. Under the pressure of my questioning, the dam finally broke. Leo confessed that Julian had been filming him in compromising situations, orchestrated pranks designed to look like Leo was stealing or hurting himself, and using those videos to blackmail him into doing Julian's elite schoolwork. Julian had even threatened to tell our parents that Leo was the one unstable person in the house, knowing the family's history of prioritizing appearances over truth. The fury that erupted in my chest was cold and calculating. I realized that my sister had raised a monster in her own image, and they were both using my son as a tool. I spent the rest of the night installing microscopic motion-activated cameras in strategic locations, one hidden within the intricate molding of my private office at the firm, and another disguised as a smoke detector in the secure file room at the ranch. I needed more than just text messages. I needed visual proof of their collusion. As I adjusted the lens of the final camera, I felt a grim sense of clarity. The family I had spent decades trying to please no longer existed. In its place was a corporate entity led by a sister who saw me as an asset to be liquidated and a son who saw my child as a slave. Sarah messaged me later that night with a chilling update. Audrey had already filed a preliminary inquiry with a court-appointed evaluator regarding my fitness to manage the family trust. They were moving faster than I anticipated, trying to lock me away before the quarterly audit could expose their embezzlement. Throughout the week, I played the part of the crumbling sister to perfection. I let my hair remain slightly unkempt, I forgot minor appointments, and I allowed Audrey to correct me in front of the staff. I watched through the remote feed on my phone as she entered my office late at night, smugly rifling through my desk for any signs of the Oak Ridge files I had already moved to a private server. I saw her and Derek laughing as they toasted to my declining health with a bottle of champagne from my private collection. Every smirk, every whispered insult caught on camera was a nail in the coffin of our relationship. Sarah's research had also uncovered that the offshore account Julian's gambling debts were paid from was registered under a shell company Derek had created using my forged signature. They hadn't just stolen money. They had set me up to take the fall for the financial crimes if the IRS ever came knocking. By Friday, the pieces were all in place. I had the financial trail of the $50,000 moved to cover Julian's Atlantic City debts, the video evidence of Audrey's nightly sabotage, and Sarah had secured a whistleblower statement from an accountant who was tired of Audrey's bullying. Most importantly, I had Leo's testimony. I sat with him in the quiet of our garden watching the sunset, and promised him that the shadow of Julian and Audrey would never fall over him again. He didn't ask how. He just leaned his head against my shoulder, finally breathing without the weight of fear. I wasn't just defending a company or a house anymore. I was dismantling a dynasty of deceit, and the sheer scale of their arrogance would be their ultimate undoing. The trap was set, and all I needed was the perfect stage to spring it, the very birthday party they thought would be the celebration of my downfall. The night before the birthday celebration, the Vance estate was shrouded in an eerie, suffocating silence. I sat alone in the darkness of my study, the only illumination coming from the twin monitors of my laptop. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as I accessed the remote server linked to the hidden cameras I had installed. I fast-forwarded through hours of grainy grayscale footage from the ranch's basement hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then the timestamp hit 4:14 p.m. from 2 days prior, and the screen flickered with a movement that made my stomach drop. I saw Leo looking small and fragile being shoved roughly toward the heavy oak door of the wine cellar by Julian. My son was crying, his lips moving in a desperate plea for mercy that the silent video couldn't capture, but his terror was written in every line of his body. What happened next shattered the last remnants of my soul. Audrey appeared in the frame, her face composed and chillingly calm, as she watched Julian pin Leo against the cold stone wall. She didn't intervene. Instead, she reached out and took Leo's sketchbook from his shaking hands, tossing it onto a nearby dusty shelf as if it were trash. When Leo tried to lung for it, Julian struck him a hard, closed-fist blow to the eye that sent my son sprawling to the floor. I let out a strangled sob, my forehead pressing against the cool glass of the monitor. On the screen, Audrey leaned down, her shadow stretching over Leo like a predator. She grabbed his chin, forcing him to look up at her, and though I couldn't hear the words, the malice in her expression was unmistakable. She was giving Julian permission. She was the architect of this cruelty, orchestrating the systematic breaking of my son's spirit to ensure Julian's academic success remained unchallenged. As Julian continued his assault, Audrey did something that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. She laughed. It wasn't a laugh of madness, but a sharp, rhythmic burst of genuine amusement as she watched her son exert dominance over mine. She stood there, crossing her arms over her expensive silk blouse, nodding in approval as Julian kicked Leo in the ribs. After several minutes of this calculated torture, she grabbed Julian by the shoulder, whispered something in his ear that made him smirk, and then they both stepped out of the room. Audrey reached back, turned the heavy iron bolt on the cellar door, and clicked the padlock into place. They left my 13-year-old son in total darkness, bruised and bleeding on a cold concrete floor simply because he had finally tried to say no to them. I watched the timestamp crawl for 3 agonizing hours before the door was finally opened again, leaving Leo to stumble out, with his head hung low in defeat. The scream that wanted to tear out of my throat died behind my clenched teeth, replaced by a cold, searing fire that consumed every ounce of grief. I didn't move for a long time, staring at the frozen image of my sister's laughing face on the screen. The urge to drive to her wing of the house and wrap my hands around her throat was almost overwhelming, a primal maternal instinct screaming for immediate blood. But I knew that a physical confrontation would only play into their hands. They were already waiting for me to break, so they could lock me away in a psychiatric ward. I forced myself to breathe slow and deep, channeling that white-hot rage into a sharp surgical precision. I began copying the files, creating multiple encrypted backups, and sending them to Sarah and a secure cloud server. This wasn't just evidence of a family spat anymore. This was evidence of felony child endangerment, kidnapping, and assault. I spent the remaining hours of the night meticulously planning the choreography of the following evening. Every guest, every business partner, and every prominent member of the New York Architectural Board would be present at that party. I calculated the exact moment I would switch the tribute video for this footage, ensuring there would be no way for Arthur or Martha to suppress the truth once it was projected onto the 10-foot screen in the ballroom. My parents' blind devotion to Audrey would be the very thing that destroyed them, as I intended to force them to watch their golden daughter's soul be stripped bare in front of the world. I moved through the house like a ghost, packing a small bag for Leo and me, making sure our essential documents were already in the car. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, my face was a mask of perfect, chilling composure. The Elena Vance they knew was gone, replaced by a woman who had seen the worst of humanity in her own bloodline and was now ready to burn the entire dynasty to the ground to save her child. The shattered crystal of Audrey's wine glass lay scattered across the floor like diamonds in a blood-red pool, but I didn't give her a second to recover. While the guests gasped and the servants hurried forward with napkins, I stepped toward the podium at the front of the grand dining hall. Since this is a celebration of family and legacy, I announced, my voice amplified by the room's acoustics and a cold, unwavering resolve. I thought it was only fitting that we share a special tribute to the real Vance family values. Audrey's face was a ghostly mask of terror, her eyes darting toward the technical booth where Sarah sat ready. Derek tried to stand his hand reaching for his jacket pocket, as if he could somehow stop the inevitable, but I signaled Sarah with a sharp nod. The overhead lights dimmed instantly, and the massive 10-foot projection screen lowered from the ceiling, cutting off the murmurs of the wealthy investors and city officials in attendance. The video didn't start with architecture or awards. It opened with the stark, high-contrast footage from the wine cellar hallway. A collective intake of breath swept through the room as the audience watched Julian shove a sobbing Leo into the dark stone room. The silence was absolute heavy with the growing realization of what they were witnessing. When the footage showed Audrey leaning against the doorframe, casually watching her son strike mine, a woman in the front row let out a muffled cry of horror. I stood in the shadows of the podium watching my parents' faces. Arthur's jaw dropped, his hand trembling as he gripped the edge of the table, while Martha's eyes filled with a confusion that rapidly turned into pure, unadulterated shame. They were seeing their golden daughter, the woman they had chosen over me, acting as a spectator to a felony assault against her own nephew. The image of Audrey laughing as she bolted the door shut hung on the screen for several agonizing seconds, searing itself into the minds of everyone who held power in our industry. Derek lunged toward the stage, his face contorted with a desperate animalistic rage. "Turn it off. This is a fabrication. She's mentally unstable, we told you," he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sheer gravity of the visual evidence. Two security guards whom I had hired independently earlier that day stepped into his path, pinning him against a marble pillar. Audrey was slumped in her chair, the red wine on her dress now looking like a permanent stain of guilt. She didn't even try to deny it. The camera had captured her soul in a way no lie could ever cover. I turned my gaze back to my parents, who were looking at me as if they didn't recognize the woman I had become. They wanted to maintain the facade to hush the scandal and handle it internally. But I had intentionally invited the very people who would ensure that was impossible. Every major partner of Vance Architectural was now a witness to child endangerment and criminal negligence. For years, I believed that blood was a bond that couldn't be broken. I said, my voice echoing in the deathly quiet room as the screen finally went black. I stayed silent while you undermined my career, and I stood by while you stole from the firm to fund Julian's vices. But you touched my son. I walked down from the podium, standing directly in front of Audrey and my parents. "Arthur, Martha, you signed over my rights because you believed her lies. You chose a predator over your own child. So here is my gift to you. You no longer have a second daughter." I reached into my clutch and pulled out a stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the table in front of Audrey. "Those are the filings for the dissolution of our partnership and a restraining order. By tomorrow morning, every news outlet in this city will have that footage. You wanted to protect the legacy, you've just watched it burn to the ground." The room erupted into a chaos of whispers and camera flashes as guests began to realize the social and legal earthquake that had just occurred. Derek was still shouting about lawsuits, but his words were hollow, the empty threats of a man who knew his credit and reputation were about to be obliterated. I looked at Leo, who was standing by the exit with Sarah, his head finally held high. The weight of the secret had been transferred from his shoulders to theirs, and for the first time in years, the air in the room felt clean. My mother reached out to touch my arm, her eyes pleading for a reconciliation that would never come, but I pulled away with a chilling finality. There would be no tearful apologies, no family meetings, and no second chances. I had spent my life building structures that could withstand any storm, and tonight I had proven that the strongest foundation I ever built was the one I stood on alone. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a synchronized thud, cutting through the frantic whispers of the guests. Instead of more socialites, a tactical team of local police officers and two stern-faced representatives from Child Protective Services marched into the room. I had coordinated this arrival down to the exact minute, ensuring the visual evidence they had just seen on the screen was still burning in their minds. "Audrey Vance and Julian Vance, you need to come with us." The lead officer announced, his voice echoing with an authority that brooked no argument. Julian, who had been sneering just minutes ago, suddenly looked like the terrified child he truly was, beneath his mask of cruelty. He tried to scramble behind his father, but the officers were faster. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping onto his wrists was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. Audrey let out a piercing shriek as an officer placed her hands behind her back, informing her that she was being detained for felony child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. The shock on the faces of the attendees was palpable, but I wasn't finished. As Derek tried to intervene, shouting about his constitutional rights and demanding to see a warrant, Sarah stepped forward with a heavy briefcase. She didn't just have a warrant, she had a mountain of forensic accounting. "Officer, while you process the assault and kidnapping charges, I am handing over evidence of systemic embezzlement and wire fraud totaling over $500,000. Sarah stated calmly, handing a thick dossier to a detective. I watched Audrey's eyes go wide as she realized that her secret offshore accounts, the ones she used to cover Julian's gambling debts, were no longer a secret. The financial crimes added a whole new layer of severity to her situation. In the United States, stealing from a corporate trust while violating labor and safety laws meant she wasn't just looking at probation. She was looking at a decade or more in a federal penitentiary. Arthur and Martha stood frozen in the center of the room, looking like statues of a forgotten era. My father tried to regain some semblance of dignity, stepping toward me with his hand raised as if to silence a disobedient child. "Elena, stop this madness at once. You are destroying our family name over a simple misunderstanding. We can handle this privately," he commanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. I looked him dead in the eye, feeling nothing but a cold, liberating detachment. "The family name was destroyed when you allowed your grandson to be tortured in your own basement, Arthur. And as for the company, you no longer have a say." I pulled out a final set of documents that Sarah had finalized an hour before the party. "I've exercised the buyout clause in our architectural partnership. Since the firm's contingency funds were used for illegal activities under your watch, the board has voted to strip you of your executive powers. You are officially retired, effective immediately." The color drained from Martha's face as she realized the implications of my words. She had spent 40 years maintaining the illusion of the Vance dynasty, and now the walls were literally closing in on her. "Where are we supposed to go, Elena? This is our home," she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. I didn't flinch. "Actually, Martha, this estate was signed over to the Vance Trust 5 years ago for tax purposes, a trust that I now sole manage, because of the power of attorney you signed for Audrey, which I have legally reclaimed through her criminal negligence. You have 48 hours to pack your personal belongings. My security team will be here to escort you to the small cottage in the valley, the one you thought was too beneath you to ever visit." The look of absolute defeat in her eyes was the final confirmation that the power dynamic had shifted forever. As the police led Audrey and Julian out through the gauntlet of shocked guests, the flashbulbs of the local press who had been tipped off by Sarah captured every moment of their disgrace. Derek was being questioned in a separate corner, his face pale as he realized that being an accomplice to Audrey's fraud would likely cost him his law license and his freedom. I stood next to Leo, my arm anchored firmly around his shoulders, watching the people who had tried to break us be dismantled by the very system they thought they were above. There was no joy in the destruction, only a profound sense of relief. The legal machinery was moving now, relentless and impartial. Audrey's credit score, her reputation, and her liberty were being erased in real time. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the daughter trying to earn love. I was the mother who had successfully defended her cub, and the cost of the victory was a price I was more than willing to pay. 6 months had passed since the dust settled on the wreckage of the Vance dynasty, and the air in Seattle felt crisper and cleaner than New York ever had. I stood on the balcony of our new firm, now rebranded as Horizon Architectural Studio, watching the sun dip below the Pacific horizon. Moving 3,000 miles away wasn't just a business decision. It was a surgical removal of the cancer that had plagued my life. Sarah had stayed behind just long enough to oversee the final liquidation of the old firm's assets, ensuring that every cent Audrey had embezzled was recovered through the forced sale of her properties and luxury vehicles. The reports Sarah sent me last week were a stark testament to the speed of a fall from grace in a country that prizes credit and reputation above all else. Audrey had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy after the court-ordered restitution stripped her of her savings. Her credit score, once a source of pride that allowed her to move millions, was now a hollowed-out ruin, making it impossible for her to even lease a modest apartment without a guarantor. The last photo Sarah sent wasn't from a gala or a boardroom. It was a grainy image taken at a commercial laundry facility in Queens. There was Audrey, the woman who used to sneer at anyone wearing off-the-rack clothing, standing in a shapeless uniform, her hands raw from industrial detergents, as she worked a double shift to pay her mounting legal fees. Her pride had been her armor, and now she was forced to survive in the very world of manual labor she had spent decades mocking. Julian's fate was even more definitive. Because of the clear video evidence of the wine cellar assault and the testimony Sarah secured from other victims at his academy, he was sentenced to 2 years in a high-security juvenile detention center, followed by 5 years of intensive probation. His future in the elite circles of New York architecture was obliterated. No university would touch a student with a record of felony assault and kidnapping. He wasn't a golden heir anymore. He was a statistic, a cautionary tale of what happens when a bully finally meets a mother with nothing left to lose. The silence from Arthur and Martha was perhaps the most profound part of my new life. After the eviction from the estate, they had been forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a nondescript suburb of New Jersey, a far cry from the sprawling Vance ranch. Sarah told me they spent their days in a cycle of mutual resentment, Arthur blaming Martha for indulging Audrey, and Martha weeping over the loss of their social standing. They had tried to call me dozens of times in the first few months, leaving voicemails filled with excuses, then pleas for financial help, and finally, bitter accusations of heartlessness. I never listened to them. I had instructed Sarah to block their numbers and filter any physical mail through a legal intermediary. I didn't hate them anymore. Hate required an emotional investment that I was no longer willing to make. They were simply strangers who shared my DNA, ghosts of a past that I had successfully exorcised. Leo walked into my office, then his charcoal pencils tucked behind his ear and a genuine bright smile on his face that I hadn't seen since he was a toddler. He was thriving in his new school, a place where his talent was recognized for its own merit rather than as a tool for someone else's success. He didn't flinch when people walked behind him anymore, and the dark circles under his eyes had vanished, replaced by a spark of creative fire. We had spent the previous weekend hiking in the Olympic National Park, just the two of us, breathing in the scent of pine and salt air. There were no hidden cameras, no whispers of sabotage, and no toxic relatives lurking in the shadows. He was healing, and in watching him find his voice again, I was finding my own. We were no longer the Vance family. We were just Elena and Leo, a team built on a foundation of genuine trust and unwavering protection. As I closed my laptop and prepared to head home, I realized that the greatest revenge wasn't the bankruptcy or the prison sentences. It was the fact that we were happy without them. The legacy I was building now wasn't about marble statues or prestigious awards. It was about the freedom to live an honest life. I had learned that family isn't a biological obligation. It's a choice we make every day to stand by the people who truly love us. The structures I designed now were lighter, more open, filled with light and space, a reflection of the internal architecture I had rebuilt within myself. I grabbed my keys and ruffled Leo's hair as we walked toward the elevator, leaving the ghosts of New York 3,000 miles behind us. The blueprint for our future was finally complete, and for the first time in my 42 years, I was the sole architect of my own destiny.